My son blocked the doorway with both arms and said, "Dad, you are not coming in while my wife's family is here." I stood there looking at my own son guarding my own doorway. That is when I remembered the envelope sitting in my glove box, and I realized I already knew how this was going to end before he did. I'm 61 years old, and until 3 weeks before that doorway moment, my life ran on a schedule so steady you could set a clock by it. 31 years doing HVAC maintenance and building systems for the local school district, which meant 3 decades of walking boiler rooms and crawl spaces so that classrooms full of kids stayed warm in the winter and cool enough in September that nobody passed out during a math test. I retired 2 years ago with a modest pension, a paid-off house on our street, and a habit of getting up at 5:30 in the morning out of pure muscle memory, even though I no longer had anywhere to be. My wife passed 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, caught late, gone within 8 months of the diagnosis. We were married 32 years before that, and I still keep her reading glasses on the nightstand because moving them felt like something I wasn't ready to do. She was the one who noticed things. She would have noticed all of this a lot sooner than I did, and some nights I still catch myself thinking that if she were here, none of it would have gotten as far as it did because she didn't let things slide the way I do. We had one son. He's 33 now, and for most of his life he was easy in a way that made me a little suspicious of my own luck. Good grades without much prodding, polite to teachers, the kind of kid who called home from college even when he didn't need anything. He studied business at a state university a few hours from home, came out with a marketing degree, and spent his 20s bouncing between jobs that never quite fit until he found his footing doing regional sales for a beverage distributor. He was steady, reliable, the kind of son a man builds his retirement plans around, not because he expects anything from him, but because it's nice to know somebody's paying attention to how you're doing. He met his future wife at a friend's engagement party 6 years ago. She was 26 then, working as an office manager for a small law firm downtown, sharp as anything, the kind of person who remembers which of your knees hurts worse and asks about it unprompted. When my son brought her around for the first time, she helped my wife clear the table without being asked, which is a small thing, but my wife noticed small things, and she liked her for it. She told me privately that night once they'd left that she thought this girl was going to be good for him, steady in a way our son sometimes needed steadying, and for the first several years of knowing her, I had no reason to think my wife's read on people, which had rarely been wrong about anything in 32 years of marriage, had failed her this one time. They got married 2 years later in a backyard ceremony my wife didn't live to see, which is one of the harder facts I've had to sit with since she passed. My son asked me to walk him through some of what his mother would have wanted for the day, and we got through it together, and for a while I thought that was the last hard thing this family was going to have to carry for a long time. I was wrong about that, but it took almost 2 years for me to find out how wrong, and by the time I understood the full shape of it, I found myself wishing more than once that my wife had been the one still sitting across from me at that kitchen table instead of just her reading glasses. What I didn't know for the first 3 years of their marriage was that my son and his wife had put almost everything they had into a small restaurant on the east side, a farm-to-table place she had wanted to open since before I ever met her. She'd left the law firm to run it full-time. He kept his sales job and helped with the books on weekends. For the first year and a half, it seemed to be doing fine. They talked about it at dinner the way people talk about something they're proud of, mentioning a good review here, a busy Friday night there. By early last year, though, something had shifted, and I noticed it the way you notice a draft in a house before you find the actual gap in the window. My son started declining invitations to things he never used to miss, a poker night with some old college friends, a Sunday game at my place. When he did show up, he seemed distracted, checking his phone more than he used to, stepping outside to take calls he wouldn't explain afterward. The first thing that actually registered as strange happened last February. My son called me on a Tuesday evening, and after the usual small talk, he asked, in a tone that was trying very hard to sound casual, whether I'd ever set up a living trust or updated my will since my wife passed. I told him no, I still had the simple will we'd done together years ago through an attorney in town who'd since retired. He said that was worth looking into eventually, that people my age should think about those things, and I said sure, someday, and didn't think much more about it. In March, I got a call at the house from a woman identifying herself as being with a title company, confirming an appointment I had no memory of making. I told her she must have the wrong number, and she apologized and hung up, and I chalked it up to a clerical error somewhere on her end. Also in March, some of my mail stopped arriving on schedule. Not all of it, just certain pieces, a bank statement one month, a property tax notice the next. I assumed it was the postal service being slow, the way it sometimes is, and didn't think to question it further. Then, in April, I stopped by their apartment to return a ladder my son had borrowed the month before. His wife was out on the back steps on a phone call, and the screen door was open enough that I could hear her without meaning to. She was telling someone, in a voice tighter than I'd ever heard from her, that she just needed a little more time, that she had something worked out, that nobody was going to lose the restaurant if she could help it. I didn't think anything of it beyond feeling for her, assuming it was a supplier or a landlord she was talking to. Looking back now, I understand exactly what that conversation meant, and exactly whose resources that plan was eventually going to draw from. None of it alarmed me at the time, taken piece by piece. I spent 31 years trusting that systems worked the way they were built to work, that a signature meant a signature and a stamped document meant somebody in an office had done their job checking it. That kind of trust serves you fine in a boiler room. It serves you a lot less well when the system being gamed is your own name. Looking back, there were other small things too, the kind that only line up into a pattern once you already know what you're looking for. My son started coming to Sunday dinner without his wife more often, saying she was busy at the restaurant, which was plausible enough on its own. He asked me once, almost in passing while we were fixing a fence post together in May, whether I still kept my important papers in the same filing cabinet in the study that my wife and I had used for 30 years. I told him yes, same drawer, same as always, because why would I have moved it? He nodded and didn't say anything else, and I went back to hammering the post in without giving the question a second thought. A neighbor of mine, an older man who's lived 2 doors down since before my son was born, mentioned to me in passing at the mailbox one afternoon that he'd seen a car he didn't recognize parked in my driveway for a while on a weekday back in March, a sedan he didn't think belonged to anyone on the street. I told him it was probably somebody visiting, a delivery, something ordinary, and thanked him for keeping an eye on the place the way he always does. I didn't think about it again until months later, once I understood what kind of visit might explain a car sitting in my driveway on a day I wasn't home to see it. He mentioned it again in passing a few weeks after that, almost apologetically, saying he hoped he hadn't been a nuisance bringing it up the first time, and I told him he hadn't been, that a man keeping an eye on his neighbor's house was never a nuisance in my book. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in June. I was in the garage sorting through some old tools when the phone rang, and a woman from my bank asked if I wanted to proceed with the home equity loan application I'd submitted the week before. I told her I hadn't submitted any loan application. There was a pause on her end, the kind that tells you the person on the other line has just recalculated something in her head, and she asked if I could come into the branch as soon as possible. I sat across from the branch manager, who'd handled my accounts for almost 15 years, going back to when my wife and I refinanced the house the first time. He pulled up the file and turned his monitor around so I could see it. There it was in plain black text, a home equity loan application, submitted online, using my house on our street as collateral, my house that had been paid off in full since 2016. The requested amount was $85,000. My signature sat at the bottom of the electronic form. I leaned in close and looked at it, and something in my chest went very still. It wasn't my signature. It was close enough that a person glancing at it quickly might not catch the difference, but the F curved the wrong way, looping back on itself in a way my own handwriting never has, not in 60 years of signing my name. He kept his voice level in a way I appreciated later, once I understood how carefully he was choosing his words. "There's a notarized authorization attached to this," he said. "Did you meet with a notary sometime in the last month or two?" I told him I hadn't been anywhere near a notary. He printed the whole file for me, every page, and I sat in the branch parking lot afterward for a long time before I trusted myself to drive. I went straight to the county recorder's office that same afternoon. It's a squat brick building downtown I'd driven past 1,000 times over the years without ever once needing to walk inside, and I remember standing at the counter feeling strangely embarrassed, like I was reporting a theft I couldn't quite prove had happened yet, even though I already knew in my gut it had. The clerk who helped me was patient, walked me through the request process, pulled up every filing associated with my name and my address without asking why a man my age was standing at her counter looking like his hands wanted to shake. There were 2 documents waiting there that I had never seen before. The loan application matched what the branch manager had shown me. Behind it, in a separate folder, sat something worse, a request to add a second name to the deed on my house, not yet finalized, sitting dormant, waiting on the loan proceeds to clear before it could move forward through the system. My house, the one my wife and I had paid down together over 2 decades, one signature away from belonging partly to somebody else. I sat in my truck in the county parking lot for close to 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive home. I kept thinking about my wife, about how many Saturday mornings we'd spent together at that kitchen table going over the mortgage statement year after year, watching the balance shrink a little more each time, treating it like a small private victory nobody outside the 2 of us would ever fully understand the weight of. It felt, sitting there in that parking lot, like somebody had reached back through all those Saturday mornings and tried to take the victory away without either of us ever being asked. I looked closely at the notary information listed on both documents, a name I didn't recognize, a commission number I didn't recognize. I called the Oregon Secretary of State's Notary Division the next morning and gave them the number, and after being put on hold for what felt like a very long time, the woman came back and told me there was no notary commission on file under that number, and no notary registered anywhere in the state under the name listed. It didn't exist. Somebody had invented a notary out of nothing and stamped it onto paper that was on its way toward taking a piece of my house. I didn't call my son that night. I sat at my kitchen table with my wife's reading glasses pushed off to one side, and I called an attorney instead, a woman who specialized in estate and elder fraud cases, recommended to me by the branch manager himself once he understood what we were dealing with. I brought her every page the following morning. She read through it once, slowly, set it down on her desk, and looked at me over her glasses. "This notary commission is fabricated," she said. "There's no legitimate way this document exists unless somebody manufactured it specifically to get past the bank without anyone asking too many questions." I asked her what that meant for what came next. She laid it out step by step. First, we would file an emergency fraud alert and dispute with with the bank, which would freeze the loan before any funds could disperse. Second, she would send a preservation letter to the county recorder to flag the pending deed request. Third, she would begin quietly gathering records to trace where the fabricated notary template had originated. And fourth, once we had enough to make the picture undeniable, we would decide together how much of it needed to go to law enforcement. In the meantime, she told me, I need you to do the hardest thing I'm going to ask of you. Don't say a word to your son. Don't confront anyone. Just live your life like none of this is happening and let the evidence finish building itself while nobody knows you're already onto it. I asked her how long that might take. She said somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks, depending on how quickly the bank's fraud department moved and how much the county was willing to cooperate with an informal request before a subpoena became necessary. 4 to 8 weeks. I remember doing the math in my head that night, counting out Sundays on the calendar, wondering how many family dinners I was going to have to sit through with this sitting underneath everything like a stone in my shoe. The waiting was harder than my attorney made it sound. I went about my Sundays the way I always had, mowing the lawn, having dinner with my sister on Thursdays, showing up to the weekly poker game I'd started hosting since my wife passed, just to have a reason to see people. Nobody at that table knew what I was carrying. I got good at nodding along to conversations while running numbers in my head, wondering how deep this actually went. One Friday night at that poker table, a retired mechanic who'd been coming to the game for years asked me, out of nowhere, whether everything was all right, because I'd folded 3 good hands in a row without seeming to notice I was doing it. I told him I was just tired, that retirement made the days blur together more than people expect. He let it go, the way old friends know how to let things go when they sense you're not ready to hand them the real answer, and dealt the next hand without pressing further. I sat there afterward, cards in my hand, thinking about how strange it was to be surrounded by people who'd known me for decades while carrying something none of them could see. The way you might carry a stone in your boot for miles without anyone noticing your gait had changed. 3 weeks into it, my attorney called with something that shifted the shape of the whole thing. She'd been quietly tracing the loan proceeds, working with a contact at the bank's fraud unit who was sympathetic to the situation, trying to understand not just how the fabricated notary got created, but where the $85,000 had been intended to go once it cleared. The disbursement instructions on the loan weren't set up to go to you, obviously, since you never applied for it, she said. They were set up to route to a business account, the restaurant. I sat with that for a long moment. I thought about the restaurant's slow, steady financial trouble that my son and his wife had never fully explained to me, the canceled plans, the tense phone call I'd overheard on the back steps in April. I thought about my son asking me back in February whether my wife and I had ever set up a trust, a question that had seemed like ordinary concern for an aging parent at the time and now sat very differently in my memory. I asked my attorney directly whether this meant my son was involved, whether he had known what was happening to my name and my house. I don't know yet, she told me, and I could hear that she meant it, that she wasn't just managing me. The account is a joint business account under both their names, which is standard for how they set up the restaurant. That doesn't tell us who initiated the loan or who created the notary credential. It tells us where the money was headed if it had gone through. Those aren't necessarily the same person. It was a distinction I turned over and over in the days that followed, lying awake some nights doing the math of it, trying to decide what I actually believed. I thought about how careful his wife had always been with small details, how she remembered things about people, how she'd helped my wife clear the table the very first time I met her. I thought about how my son had gone quiet and distracted over the past year in a way that could be explained by financial stress just as easily as by guilt. I called my sister one night and told her everything because I needed to say it out loud to somebody who wasn't billing me by the hour. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line, and then she said the thing I hadn't let myself say yet. Whichever one of them did this, she said, the other one is either lying to protect them or too afraid to ask the question you're asking right now. Either way, you're not going to like what family dinner looks like once you know for certain. She was right about that, though it would take a few more weeks and a family dinner I didn't yet know was coming before I found out exactly how right. What I didn't know yet, sitting at my kitchen table turning all of this over, was that the loan and the deed request weren't the whole picture. There was a third piece still sitting undiscovered in the county system, one my attorney wouldn't uncover until the week everything finally came to a head, and it was going to answer the one question that mattered more than any of the rest of it. Not just where the money was supposed to go, but exactly whose hands had built the fake credential that was supposed to move it there. 5 weeks after the bank first called me, my son phoned to invite me to a Saturday dinner at their apartment. His wife's parents were driving up from out of town for the weekend, and he wanted, in his words, everyone together to celebrate some good news about the restaurant. A new investor interested in coming on board to help cover the gap. I didn't ask what gap. I already knew. I asked my attorney that same week whether we were far enough along to move. She told me the fraud dispute had cleared through the bank's internal process, the loan officially flagged and frozen before a single dollar had disbursed, and the preservation letter to the county had successfully stalled the deed request in its tracks. What she still didn't have, as of that Thursday, was a name attached to the fabricated notary credential itself. I have a theory, she told me over the phone, but I don't have proof yet, and I'm not going to hand you a theory to walk into that dinner with. Give me until Monday. I told her the dinner was Saturday. She was quiet quiet for a second and then said carefully that if I could hold off confronting anyone until she called me with whatever she found, that would be the safest path. I told her I wasn't sure I could sit at a table with my son and his in-laws for 3 hours, pretending none of this existed, not after 5 weeks of pretending already. I thought about calling my son and telling him to cancel the dinner, inventing some excuse, buying myself another few days. But some part of me, the part that had spent 31 years walking into boiler rooms not knowing exactly what he'd find, decided I needed to see his face when I said it out loud, needed to know in the moment, not from a report my attorney handed me later, whether my son already understood what had been done in my name. I drove over that Saturday evening, a full hour before the dinner was supposed to start, planning to catch my son alone in the kitchen before his wife's parents arrived, before the noise of the evening made any real conversation impossible. I sat in my truck outside their building for a few minutes first, running through what I was going to say, trying to find a version of it that didn't sound like an accusation, even though that's exactly what it was. I still hadn't found the right words by the time I got out of the truck and walked up to their door. I'm not sure there were right words to find. My son met me at the door before I'd even made it past the second porch step. He must have seen my truck pull up through the front window and come out to head me off, because he was already standing in the doorway when I reached it, one hand still on the frame like he'd just gotten there himself. "Dad," he said, and something in his voice was tighter than I'd heard from him in years. "You're early. Her parents aren't here yet, and things are a little chaotic right now." I told him that was fine, that I actually wanted a few minutes alone with him before everyone else arrived. He hesitated, glancing back over his shoulder into the apartment, and then stepped further into the doorway rather than out of it, which struck me even in the moment as an odd thing for a son to do to his own father. "Dad, whatever it is, can it wait until after tonight? She's under a lot of pressure with her parents coming, and I don't want anything throwing off the evening." "It can't wait," I said. "Not after everything I've been carrying around for the past 5 weeks. His face changed then, some of the color going out of it, and I understood in that instant that he had at least some sense of what was coming, even if he didn't know the specifics. His wife appeared behind him a moment later, drying her hands on a dish towel, and when she saw my expression, she went still in the hallway, the way a person goes still when they realize a room has already turned against them before they've said a word. She started to say something, caught herself immediately, and I noticed it even in the middle of everything else happening, the way her voice had started sliding toward a name that wasn't mine before she corrected course. "Is everything okay?" she said instead. I didn't answer her directly. I looked at my son instead. That's when he put both arms out and blocked the doorway, palms braced against either side of the frame, his body squared up in a way that had nothing casual left in it. "Dad," he said, "you are not coming in while my wife's family is here." I stood there looking at my own son guarding my own doorway, blocking me from a home I had never asked to enter uninvited, defending a threshold against the one person in this whole situation who had actually been wronged. Something in me went very quiet in that moment, the same stillness I remembered from sitting in the bank parking lot 5 weeks earlier, my hands flat and useless on the wheel. "There's a loan against my house," I said, $85,000, filed against a home I paid off years ago, with a notary stamp on it from a woman who doesn't exist anywhere in the state of Oregon. And behind that loan sits a request to put a second name on my deed. I've known about it for 5 weeks. I've had a lawyer working on it that whole time. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Her hand had gone still against the dish towel. "I was trying to help this family," she finally said, her voice low, careful, like she was choosing each word with real effort. "The restaurant needed a bridge, just a few months, and I knew if I asked you directly you'd say no, or you'd want to loop in people and slow it down until it was too late to matter. I was going to pay every cent of it back before you ever had to know it existed." "That doesn't explain the fake notary," I said. "That doesn't explain why my signature on that form doesn't match my own handwriting. You don't forge a stranger's signature and manufacture a state credential to protect somebody. You do that to take something from them without asking." My son hadn't moved his arms from the door frame, but something in his posture had started to buckle, like a support beam finally giving under weight it had been holding for longer than anyone else could see. "Tell him you didn't do that part," he said quietly, not looking at me anymore. "Tell him that's not what happened." She didn't answer him. She looked at the dish towel in her hands instead of at either of us, and the silence that followed told me more than any confession could have. I didn't stay to watch whatever came next between the two of them. I turned around, walked back down the porch steps to my truck, and sat behind the wheel for a moment before I called my attorney. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you to tell me whatever you found," I said. "All of it, right now." My attorney didn't make me wait. She'd been sitting on the finding since that morning, holding it until she had a clearer sense of when I'd need it. "The bank's fraud unit finished tracing the loan application's digital footprint yesterday afternoon," she said. "Every online application logs an IP address and a device fingerprint at submission. The application using your name was submitted from a residential IP address registered to their apartment on a laptop the bank system flagged as previously associated with your daughter-in-law's login on the restaurant's business banking portal." I asked her what that meant in plain terms, because after 5 weeks of legal language, I wanted something I could hold on to without a law degree. "It means the loan itself was submitted from a device she uses regularly on their home network," my attorney said. "But there's more, and this is the part I wanted to confirm before I told you anything. The fabricated notary credential wasn't wasn't just a stamp somebody photoshopped onto a page. Whoever built it used a notary supply template ordered online 3 months ago. I subpoenaed the order records from the supplier this week. The order was placed using a credit card in her name, shipped to a P.O. box she'd opened under her maiden name 2 weeks before the loan application was ever submitted. I sat with that in the truck for a long moment, the engine still off, their apartment window visible through the windshield. So it was her, I said, not him. The evidence points to her having built and submitted everything herself, my attorney said. I can't tell you with certainty what your son knew or didn't know beforehand. That's a separate question, and it's one only he can really answer. But the paper trail on the forgery and the fabricated credential leads to one person, and it isn't your son. I thought about the phone call I'd overheard through the screen door back in April, her voice tight, telling someone she just needed a little more time, that nobody was going to lose the restaurant on her watch. I thought about how careful she'd always been, how she remembered things about people, how that same carefulness had apparently gone into ordering supplies under a P.O. box and a maiden name so the trail would be harder to follow. What happens now? I asked. Now the bank's fraud department formally refers the forged loan application to their internal investigations unit, which typically results in a referral to the county district attorney's office, my attorney said. Forgery of a financial instrument and identity theft are both felony offenses in Oregon when the amount involved exceeds this threshold. Separately, the notary fraud itself gets referred to the Secretary of State's office, since fabricating a notary credential is its own violation under state law. I'll be filing the civil side, the fraud complaint, and the request for a permanent injunction on the deed action this week. I asked her whether any of it could still be undone quietly, whether there was a version of this where it stayed inside the family and didn't become the kind of thing with a case number attached to it. Her voice had something gentler in it than I'd heard from her in 5 weeks of mostly procedural conversation. Somebody manufactured a state credential and used it to try to take a piece of your house without your knowledge, she said. That's not a family disagreement I can quietly mediate. That's a crime that happened to you, and the systems that exist to catch exactly this kind of thing are already moving. I know that's not the answer you wanted. It wasn't. But sitting there in the truck, looking at the apartment window one more time before I finally started the engine, I understood that it was the only honest one available. I drove home that night without calling my son. I didn't hear from him until 2 days later, on a Monday afternoon, and when I picked up the phone I could tell before he even said anything that he'd been crying. The kind of crying that happens after a person has run out of other things to feel. Dad, he said, the bank called me too. They called both of us in for a meeting about the account. I had to sit there and listen to a fraud investigator lay out an entire timeline in front of me. The P.O. box, the credit card, all of it, and I kept thinking, why didn't she just tell me the restaurant was this bad? I would have found another way. I would have never let this happen to you. I asked him the same question that had been sitting underneath everything since that Saturday on the porch. Did you know any part of it before I told you? No, he said, and something in the way he said it, worn down past the point of performing anything, told me he meant it. I knew the restaurant was in trouble. I knew she was stressed about money. I didn't know any of the rest of it. I swear to you I didn't know. I believed him, not because I wanted to, not out of some easy fatherly instinct to protect him from consequence, but because my attorney's evidence had already told me the same thing days before he said it out loud, and because I'd watched his face crack open on that porch in a way no amount of rehearsal can fake. Why didn't you just tell me at the door instead of standing there blocking it? He asked, and I could hear that the question had been eating at him. Because I needed you to hear the truth of it from somebody who wasn't your father standing on your porch making an accusation, I said. I needed the bank to say it. I needed the state to say it. If I'd told you myself that Saturday with nothing behind me but my own word, you'd have spent months caught between believing me and believing her, and I wasn't going to do that to you. I wanted you to hear it the way I heard it, from people whose whole job is getting it right. The weeks that followed moved slower than the 5 that had come before them, in the particular way that anything involving lawyers and county offices tends to move once the worst of the shock has already happened, and all that's left is paperwork catching up to what everyone already knows. My daughter-in-law was charged that August with forgery in the first degree and criminal impersonation of a notary public, both felonies under Oregon law given the dollar amount involved and the fabricated state credential. My attorney told me the district attorney's office moved faster than expected, in part because the evidence trail she'd built made the case close to undeniable before it ever reached a courtroom. My daughter-in-law pled guilty that October to a reduced single count of forgery in exchange for the impersonation charge being dropped, receiving 3 years of probation, a restitution order covering my legal fees, and a permanent bar from ever holding a notary commission in the state. The restaurant closed in September. My attorney told me the fraud investigation had turned up enough about the restaurant's finances that its failure had likely been coming regardless of whether the loan against my house had gone through, that the $85,000 would have delayed the inevitable by perhaps half a year at most. I didn't find much comfort in that, but I understood why she thought I might want to know it. My son moved out of the apartment in late September. He and his wife separated, not immediately filing for divorce, but living apart while things worked themselves through the legal process on its own timeline, and he's been staying in a rental near my sister's place since. He calls me now most weeks, sometimes twice, which is more than he called in the year before before any of this happened. It isn't fixed between us, not entirely. My attorney told me once in an offhand moment near the end of the case that some things take longer to repair than a single court filing can account for, and I found that to be true more often than I expected. But he came to Thanksgiving. He sat next to me at the table instead of across from me the way he used to, which felt like a small thing and also felt like the only thing that mattered that day. The house is still mine, deed clean, nothing pending against it. The loan long since closed out and marked satisfied without a dollar ever having moved. I had the locks changed the week after the charges were filed, not because I thought my daughter-in-law would ever show up at my door, but because some nights I still wanted the simple, physical fact of knowing that nothing could get into that house without my say-so, not a person and not a piece of paper with my name signed onto it by somebody else's hand. It's a Sunday evening now, 4 months after that dinner that never happened, and my sister is in my kitchen arguing with a pot roast recipe that has personally offended her in some way she won't fully explain. My son is out on the back porch, and through the window, I can see him sitting in the same chair my wife used to sit in on evenings like this one, not doing anything in particular, just sitting there the way a person sits when he's finally stopped waiting for the next bad thing to arrive. I walk out and sit down across from him. Neither of us says much for a while.